Welcome to the Demi Taste Podcast, where we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Usually, we talk about whiskey, but the best thing about whiskey is the conversations that we get to have, and we get to talking about a little bit of everything. Our special guest today is Jason Parker, founder of Copperworks Distilling in Seattle, and a man of many talents. You're increasing your capacity for aging. Um, do you anticipate? Well, here's I'm just going to veer off. Do you anticipate there's going to be a difference in aging profile between the distillery barrels and the Kenmore tasting room barrels?
No, and here's why. One of the things that traditional products do is that they age in unrefrigerated, unheated warehouses. And so that is a very big part of the barrel contribution and the angel's share and the chemistry that happens during maturation. Temperature changes and specific temperatures implicate flavor. So we have warehouses that are heated and cooled. So they're 70 degrees or 65 to 70 degrees in the case of Kenmore year round. They're not going through changes like they are in Kentucky, Tennessee, even Scotland. Scotland's changes are all down here and cold, but they're still going through summer diurnal changes as well. Those are important for those flavor profiles, and that we are not beholden to any flavor profile that's a traditional product. So we're actually optimizing for warm temperatures, 70 degrees, and that gives us a lot more what's called oxidation and esterification, the thing that makes whiskey taste mature, not caramel, not barrel wood, but actually tastes mature. And when I use this, think about things like tobacco and coffee and dried fruit and those esters that you think of as a mature whiskey. Those are a product of a chemistry that's happening inside the barrel, and it's temperature dependent. Every 10 degrees centigrade you drop below room temperature, that process, that esterification, cuts in half. So a lot of the world's whiskeys are gaining calendar months or gaining age over their time in a barrel, but they're not gaining mature flavors because they're too cold. So back to your question, if we keep all of our warehouses consistent temperature, we're not seeing one warehouse get hot, another warehouse get cold, and therefore those are different. And that's why I can answer, no, they're not different. We're not worried about a sea breeze coming in. Or not, there's nothing that is affecting it in a closed warehouse.
And
That
conversely, there's quite a lot of heat from the stills, and you're air conditioning that space. So having gone on the distillery tour in there, it's not as overwhelmingly hot as you might expect from some other distilleries in there.
Yeah, we have 860 cubic feet of air a minute moving through that distillery. You go into Westland's still room, and it's hot. I mean, it's like 120, but not their barrel warehouse. Their barrel warehouse in Hoquiam is a dunnage warehouse, and it's well, of course, they're not using that warehouse anymore, but that's where a lot of the products that are in bottles came from. They're now using a warehouse in Burlington. But I mean, all of these have um, the more traditional types of cool temperatures, much more like Scotland. And that's perfect for their brand, their story, their flavors, and especially their fermentation and then distillation process.
being a bit of a nerd, I've read a little bit about, pre-prohibition. A lot of the distilleries across the U.S. tended to have a different thought process for aging, and a lot of distilleries, particularly there was a large one in Pennsylvania, used or had steam heated warehouses to maintain even temperature across the year. And I wonder if sort of the your approach to that uh, is sort of a return to something that just sort of stopped happening in the States?
Yeah, that's an interesting. That's a great perspective. You're giving me a lot more credit than I deserve. But let me, because in other words, I didn't think through it from the historical point about like let's bring that back. Let me tell you why I did think about it. When a traditional distillery is doing um, its wash, it doesn't boil the wort, and so the wort is not sanitized. So it goes into open wooden fermenters traditionally, which are steam cleaned but not sanitary. So that means that when you're in the Bourbon Trail, the guide will invite you to run your fingers in through that fermenting wash and taste it. And that's a thing that you would never find a brewer to do. So bacteria, lactic acid and acetic acid, wild yeast are products that add to the traditional flavors. They add texture, they add mouthfeel, they add aroma, and they're all part of a traditional flavor. What helps clean those negatives that come out of that, temperature regulated fermenter will hit 100 to 110 degrees and it will create sulfites a lot more readily than a cool fermentation will do. Brewers know this, which is why brewers always temperature control their fermentations if they're looking for a cleaner tasting beer, but not distilleries. Distilleries don't boil, they have wild yeast and bacteria. They do a fermentation that gets up to 100, 110 degrees. They create sulfides, dimethyl sulfide, trimethyl sulfide, things that smell like cooked cabbage or rotten eggs. That has to get aged out, but it doesn't age. So it gets interacted with the copper, which helps bring that out. But the barrel itself, especially in America, where sour mash is a really big deal, has a heavy char in there, and that balances that acidity that the lactic acid bacteria created. It balances the kind of the sweetness of the corn, and having those temperature changes is another big part of getting that barrel to work and move that whiskey in and out of the staves. But if you don't have those problems to start with, and you didn't make a wash that has wild yeast, acetic acid, lactic acid bacteria, that has runaway fermentation temperatures and creates a lot of dimethyl sulfide, then you're going to be focused primarily on the third thing that a barrel does, and that is that oxidation esterification. So the one thing that you would want to do is to keep it warm and to not allow a blanket of alcohol or water vapor to sit on the edge of the barrel. That's going to reduce migration out and air back in. So that's why when you go into a traditional dunnage warehouse, it smells so good. It smells like old whiskey and kind of wet wood, and it's like just the most delicious, heady smell. You feel like you're getting drunk breathing. You come into our warehouse, it smells like fresh air. And that's good because that means that we don't have the blanket protecting the migration of air into that barrel. And when air goes into that barrel, it oxidizes compounds, turns them into acids. When the acid bumps into the alcohol, they form an ester, and that's what we're looking for. So keeping it warm and keeping it aerated is based on the fact that we started with a beer. I wish it was based also on a traditional thing, but honestly, it never even crossed my mind that people used to warm their warehouses. It does cross my mind that, say, Cavalon in Taiwan can produce a jet black, incredibly interesting and delicious whiskey in 3 to 4 years. And that's because their warehouses get so incredibly hot. Their angel shares between 12 and 20% a year. So if they waited as long as 7 years, that barrel would be flat empty, just a bunch of tar in the bottom of it. But those are the decisions that you get to make: is how do you put your raw material in, and what's warehouse conditions going to be to create those flavors. One's not better than the other; they're just different, and they make different tastes. God, I just love to ramble. I hope that made sense.
Yeah,
That
that
was
was
good.
really cool.
It was a nice segue, or sorry, a nice aside, a nice tangent. We like tangents here. I was about to ask about brewing, so maybe we come back around to that a little bit. So how much input do you have in the beer production? Do you go there as part of doing the mashes? Do you just give them specifications? This is we're talking about talking cedar. Um, what other kinds of inputs do you have in that process?
Well, for all of the breweries that we work with, so Pike, Elysian, Fremont Brewing, and Talking Cedar, we have a lot. So we buy all the malt directly from the malt house or from the farmer to have it malted. We ship that, so it's all our purchase. They aren't involved in buying the specifications. It's our recipes, so we send everything to them on what it's going to be in strike liquor, temperature, pH, any brewing salts, how long we're going to hold it with the mash profile will be, how long the boil is. We explain all of this, and here's what we normally have to explain multiple times. We're not targeting yield. Everybody who has thought about a distillery thinks that they want to target yield. Okay, I got 9.5% alcohol out on there. I was like, damn it. And they're like, why? Isn't that good? And I was like, no, I want 9% or even 8.5% because I want to keep the rest of that malt as flavor, texture, and even something that can caramelize on the steam coils and add a whole new dimension of flavor. Not targeting yield, targeting flavor. So we work really hard at the beginning. We come up with an SOP, we train the brewers, we do that on site, we do that over, if we're not physically on site, we do that with text and phone calls and emails. Okay, we're here in the boil. How long do you want us to boil? It looks like we have this amount. What do you want to target? Do you want to target starting gravity, or do you want to target volume? I'm like, starting gravity. I don't care what the volume is as long as it starts with the right flavor profile. They're like, oh, we thought it'd be the other way around. We could add water and get it to your volume. I was like, nope, don't do that. It's not going to be the same flavor. So all of this is something that we get to control. Now, we don't pull any of the levers, change any of the valves, push the buttons. That's all being done by the brewers who are hired by those brew houses. And that's what's been so remarkable about this. We get such qualified brewers. Those are really good breweries, all of the ones we've mentioned, all the ones we've worked with. They have really good equipment we couldn't afford. I mean, I'm guessing Talking Cedar's got to be in the $50 to $75 million build out, for that whole plant. And we get to use that equipment to make our product. That's fantastic. That's way better than we should be able to do. But because of relationships over the years, we were able to get that happening. And so we do constantly talk. As a matter of fact, we build not only our SOPs or standard operating procedures for making it, but then also the reports. What do you want to hear back? Do you want to hear pHs, and what do you want to see on the yeast fermentation profile? What type of yeast are you using? I mean, all of this sort of stuff is things that we really are directing and helping that brewer become our extension of a brewer. We hire brewers as distillers, as a matter of fact. So that's another fun thing, is that, you could hire a distiller, and our first distiller was a distiller, but our second distiller is a brewer. And why do we want to focus on brewers, not distillers? Because brewers know sanitation, and that's important to our flavor profile. Distillers kind of don't think sanitation matters, because you're going to boil it, you're going to distill it, nothing can live through that. And by the way, bacteria can give extra yield. I'm like, yeah, but the flavor is not the same. And that's just not what we do here. So, we are very proud when people come in and they say, man, your distillery is clean. It's like, well, hell yeah, it's like a brewery, isn't it? I'm like, yeah, it's like a brewery. It's clean. Good. That's what we want. So it's a whole nother story. But yeah, we brew with qualified brewers, but we don't pull the levers. We just make the processes.
You mentioned yeast, and that leads to another question I had. Do you also provide them, the various brewing partners that you work with, do you provide them with yeast that you've sourced, or a particular variety of yeast, or is it a kind of a commodity brewer's yeast?
No, it's definitely not better. The first, so remember that for the first, we've been open 10 years. For the first 8.5 years, we did all the fermentation at our house in our own plant downtown on the waterfront. So we were just bringing sweet wort over. The yeast we preferred, of the yeast that I had easily and readily available in quantities to me, were the Pike Brewery's yeast. And I, of course, knew that yeast, helped select it and generate that from its original days. And the Elysian's House Ale yeast. I opted for the Elysian yeast for two reasons. Well, for multiple reasons, but one was they had a bigger production plan. They always had more yeast available for me than Pike did. But more importantly, both of them made really good esters at 70 degrees, 68 to 70 degrees fermentation. I love the flavor profile. They were both about the same in attenuation, which means they consumed about the same amount of sugars and left behind the same amount of mouthfeel and texture and aroma. But the one thing that uh, the Pike's yeast was not as flocculent. So that means it doesn't settle into the cone as easily or readily as the Elysian's yeast does. So I really wanted to not put yeast into this pot still. Remember, all bourbon is grains in and yeast in to a continuous column still, which then goes to a second pot still. All and same thing with Tennessee. Scotch, Irish, and Japanese put yeast into their first beer stripping still. And I find that adds a sort of meaty texture that can sometimes even translate into more like a Play-Doh. Don't like it. So we are focused on bright beer, that is beer with no yeast going into the stills. That's why we had those 2 extra weeks of conditioning. And only we can do that, or any other brewer come distiller who makes clear, clean wash with no bacteria can do that because we can wait. It won't sour on us. It goes into the still as still delicious beer. No longer tasting like green beer, but tasting like fresh beer. So those yeasts, those two yeasts, the Elysian House Ale yeast and the Pike yeast, are both good yeast. Now, when we started with Talking Cedar, we were trying to triangulate between getting fresh yeast from the Elysian Brewery, which had just come out of the cone in one of their ferments, and bringing the wash over from Talking Cedar. So we did a lot of trials of the Talking Cedar ale yeast. And it also is a very good attenuative, but not too attenuative, floral producing ester and flocculent yeast. So now we've switched to that yeast, and we've been using that yeast from them for a year and a half. But yeast matters.
And
And
so
Scotland,
that, to clarify, that yeast is used across all of your brewing partners for your mash, for your
mm-hmm.
wash.
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
correct. And
So
Scott,
that leads to my next question.
go ahead.
Sorry, I'll let you. That sounds like it's going to be a more interesting comment than my question. So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in Scotland, they do two things that I find very fascinating because Scotland tastes different, doesn't it? So it's not to say that yeast is the only thing that contributes, or that the shape of the still is the only thing that contributes. They use the same malt. They all do. They all use the same base malt. Remember, they don't put caramel malts, specialty malts, or roasted malts, or anything in. They're all using 100% pale malt. A few of them actually have floor malting facilities, so 5 to 10% of their malt may come from their floor malting, but most of it is standard big batch. And it's all whatever the Brewing and Distilling Congress says to grow that year, our equivalent of American Malt and Brewing Association's determinations. So they are doing it, they're selecting barley based on, gosh, stand resistance, blight resistance, bug resistance, yield agronomic decisions. And all of that is non-differentiating. And they all use the standard M70 yeast. They all use it. It's like this yeast that they get out of England. It's in a cake form, and it does a great job of producing lots of alcohol per ton of grain. So it's very efficient. We don't target efficiency, targeting flavor. So we have actually experimented with that yeast just to see what it tasted like. We have barrels finally of 10 different yeast experiments that we did. And so we're going to be tasting the barrels here, they're probably about a half a year to a year away from being ready to taste. And that'll be a lot of fun. Here's Copperworks standard product, 10 different yeasts. Let's just see what that does. But I'm a big fan of brewer's yeast, not distiller's yeast. So that's what we do, unlike the Scots, the Irish, the Japanese, the Kentuckians. Yeah. So what was your question?
I've forgotten now. But I did, since we were talking about yeast, let's go on and talk about grain. So you did mention that between the salmon safe and not salmon safe, there's no difference in grain, I think is what you said.
Yeah,
Did I hear
yeah,
you correctly?
right, right. In other words, we can buy from one farm Genie, the variety of barley called Genie, and from another farm, the variety of barley called Genie that is grown with salmon safe certification. So we've done both, and we are prioritizing the one that's salmon safe certified. But there's no difference in the variety. There, of course, is a difference in the field and the farm and the harvest temperatures and the rainfall and all of that, whether it's on the east side of the Cascades of the temperature extremes or the west side of the Cascades of more rainfall. Those are all part of the story too.
So, do I understand correctly, though, that there are multiple varieties of barley that you use across different mashes? Uh, if I'm not mistaken, so Genie, obviously, you've got Baroness. I believe Release 47 was a 5 malt recipe blended with Baroness.
Right, right.
What role do you feel the barley has in terms of what you end up doing with those barrels as they mature?
I think I'm going to answer this question correctly. So,
Or maybe it's a multi-part question and I just bury the lead a little on first of all, do you notice a difference in flavor? Second of
yeah.
all, how does that impact what you do with it?
So two thoughts here. We have two recipes. One of the recipes does not focus on barley variety. It's called the 5 malt recipe, and whatever differentiation may come from differences in barley variety or terroir or harvest year are all obfuscated by the intense flavors of the caramel malts and crystal malts and roasted malts. So that's the 5 malt recipe. The
And
other
that's about the malting process, not about the grain per se.
Yes, exactly. It's about the kiln drying, which is part of the malting process. Absolutely right. On the other hand, are the single farm, single variety, single vintage malts, a program that we're always going to do, and we're looking for the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is this farm for this variety, grown in this manner, malted this way, tastes unlike anything you can ever get. The only place you can get it, Baroness is a good example. The only place you can get that flavor is from Joseph's Granary. When Bill Myers grows that grain and Link Foods malts it, we taste something that we never taste from any other farm, from any other variety, from any other malt house. And that's what we want to present as Baroness, as whiskey. But right next to it, the same year, we will have bought Copeland malt or Fritz malt or full pint malt, and we would have done similar experiences and made sure that those flavors are single farm, single variety, single vintage. So you can see the harvest year of that grain. And you can tell us. Now, remember, there's a million other factors that can influence this. And so it is not science. It's just simply our experiment of playing with these ingredients and wondering to what degree do they have a flavor influence. And I'll tell you, they do have a flavor influence. What I can't tell you is there any way to control it? Matter of fact, I think the answer is no. You would have to be 10,000 years old of doing this to have learned that flavor mashed this way at these pHs and times and temperatures, and then milled this way and with this strain of yeast and these cuts going into this type of barrel in these warehouse conditions and presented at this proof, that would be remarkable. And that's just too much for anybody to know in a lifetime. Yeah, but that's what we're working on. So that's the answer about does malt flavor matter? And the answer is yes. And it's going to be just like a harvest or a vintage of wine. We can't tell you if it's going to be good or better than the one you had before. We just know that we're not striving for consistency. We're striving to find out what those flavors are. And that's a lot of fun for us, just as much as it is for you to see what this release has.
I think this is going to be a really short question, but that just got me thinking. Do you in any way optimize for your vodka and gin when you're defining uh, the malt, every other aspect of the malting and distilling that you do?
No, no, we do the same fermentation profile, same mash profile. I mean, the only obvious difference is that we don't we put it into a column still and to raise that proof way up high. So then all bets are off as what it's going to be from there. But we'll literally take half of a fermenter and make it into whiskey, and the other half of the fermenter make into vodka. So it is that consistent.
I've been thinking here. We haven't given Phil a whole lot of a chance to weigh in today, and I think part of that is because we're getting a ton of great information from you, Jason. Maybe let's get into a little bit of opinion or experience-based questions. This could be fun. I'm gonna make a broad, not quantifiable statement, and maybe phrase it as a question. When I first heard you on somebody else's podcast talking about the impact of the brewing mentality on flavor that comes out of the barrel at the end. At the time, it sounded like that was not necessarily a widely accepted idea, at the very least, because not a whole lot of people were doing it. This was easily 3 or 4 years ago. So I think people have started to come around a lot more in American single malt and seeing what it's capable of. At the time, I preferred to think of it. So to take the brewer mentality at face value, the Westland, the Westward, the Copperworks, and so on, that do the brewing approach, and say that matters. The question is only how much does that matter?
Mm-hmm.
And my completely non-quantifiable answer, I'd say maybe it matters 5 to 10% of the flavor difference if you did something, just to throw out a number. And one great way to get a good answer is to say the wrong thing. So nobody light me up in the comments or anything because I'm saying something like that. Maybe it sounds too small, maybe it sounds too big, I don't know. But that's an interesting question, right? How much do you think it matters, the brewing inputs to the whiskey outputs?
I think that the brewing process, like boiling the wash, um, and fermenting with the brewer's yeast for a long fermentation and conditioning time, are fully describe the Copperworks profile. The fact that we can bottle at 100 proof and it not feel like that, it feels like 90 or 86 proof. The fact that it has a long finish are all based on the fact that there is a residual complex sugar left behind, coats the tongue, leaves a long finish. It allows you to have that finish without the burn that you would normally get in a 100 proof bourbon or 100 proof scotch. So I would say it's a huge contributor to flavor there. The choice of barleys, the choice of individual grain varieties and farms that they come from is not as impactful because the barrel gets in the way so much. What's much more important is yeast. If I asked you, or you would probably know, if I asked a general person on the street, where does flavor from whiskey come from? The first thing you say is the barrel, because they've heard that and because it sounds fun. The second thing they would say is the water, because they've heard that, and that is, of course, dead wrong. Sure, you need to treat the water, you need to have good water, blah, 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 but it is not the water. The third thing they might say is, well, if they even know that whiskey comes from grain, is the grain. And that generally is not true. But the real place where flavor is developed is yeast, right? Yeast creates flavor. Yeast creates CO2, alcohol, a whole bunch of conjugars, and those conjugars are the raw material for flavor. So if you don't choose the right yeast and the right fermentation profile, you're not going to get the same flavor. You can have the same yeast, ferment it hot or ferment it cold, and you're going to have two different whiskeys. So the brewing ethos of fermenting cooler than traditional distilleries is huge. And then using not yield targeted yeasts, but flavor targeting yeast are also huge. So many modern brewers now are using such interesting, fascinating yeasts that I can only hope I'm around to taste the whiskeys that those brewers produce with those incredible yeasts. I mean, the grain could even be commodity grain, but they can get flavors that turn into concentrated flavors and then through barrel maturation turn into whole new things. It's just going to be an amazing world out there. So I think there's a category. I'm not answering your question anymore. I'm thinking there's a category of whiskey that will be here in 10 to 20 years that will be well understood. That's a whiskey that comes from a brewer's philosophy of flavor as opposed from a traditional philosophy of flavor. And that's what's going to be really fascinating is that. So the short answer is 5 to 10% I don't agree with. I would say 50% of the Copperworks differentiation comes from our brewing approach.
Yeah, I would say I'm mostly basing that number on sort of what my gut impression was when people say, "Oh, at the time, 4 years ago, I hadn't done a whole lot of my own personal research, let alone my own sensory research, so I wouldn't have been able to say." But I can absolutely, I agree that it's more significant than 5 or 10% because you can tell a qualitative difference between these American single malts that are made with a brewer's mindset, and it's not apples to apples, but the most common thing that you'd have access to besides that, or at least the most common thing, let's say the most common thing in the United States that you would have access to, is bourbon made on a column still and aged in new charred oak, and that flavor development profile is just so different, and you can tell that there's something about the brew. If you've ever been a fan of beer, you can tell there's something coming through from a really good beer in something like Copperworks,
Matt,
and that's
Matt,
completely absent from the bourbon.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and good because it never is a beer. I mean, you don't drink corn mash beer. You can drink American Pilsner that has a lot of corn in it, but what I'm saying. You don't drink
I think
corn
there
mash.
there may be one beer brand that does make from a corn mash, but we'll not get into that.
I did into that. When Matt and I, Matt Hoffman from Westland and I were first really comparing our differences, what was really fun about what Westland did is Westland took Scotch and applied a beer concept to it, but they didn't start with beer and apply a whiskey concept to it. So Copperworks is much more beer than Westland is. Westland is much more Scotch than we are. And that's because, they don't boil their wash. They do use a brewer's yeast, Belgium yeast, which is a high ester producer, but their fermentation is a long 5 days, sometimes 7 days, right? So that's way longer than traditional Scotch or Irish or Japanese whiskeys, but a third of what a brewery would be doing. Since they don't boil or wash, they don't get concentrated sugars. Concentrated sugars add a completely new dimension to yeast behavior, yeast ester output. If you've ever had a strong ale, a Scotch ale, a lot of the flavors that you're tasting are yeast products because of that high gravity. The osmotic pressure on that yeast cell creates a whole new environment and a whole new way for it to produce flavors. And I feel like our high gravity brewing, 18 Plato, 1074 specific gravity, is way different But here's the one that's the most critical. Westland, like all other good, more traditional distilleries, end up with a terminal gravity of 0 or even below 0. That means that if you were a home brewer and you were dipping your hydrometer into that sample, it would float below 0. You'd say, it's bone dry. There's absolutely no sugar left in there. Great, high yield. That's not what we do. Ours still has all this residual sugar in there. That's a brewing aesthetic. Brewers leave sugar behind. It adds flavor. It adds texture and mouthfeel. So that's why I say we're going to have to wait a little while. Christian Krogstad at Westward doesn't. He also goes to 0. That's just still, even though he was a brewer just like I was, he's also adopted a little more traditional distilling aspects. But we're going to see a lot of brewers using square on beer aesthetics to make whiskeys. And that's and whiskey's, whiskey's ready to take off. Whiskey's going to take off just the way beer did. I mean, beer now has probably 200 categories that you can win a gold medal in the Great American Beer Festival. When I started entering competitions in 1989, we had maybe 24 categories. They were all classics. They were all, German styles and British styles. And, there was no experimentation. But now, you can win a category in things that you can't even fathom. And I think that's going to happen in whiskey someday. Hope I'm around.
I'm really excited. Now I'm really excited to see what happens at a distillery that is local to me that recently moved into a space that they now share with a brewery.
Yeah.
And see how that affects what they're doing, because I can't imagine that won't change how they operate, and especially if they're working together as closely as they seem to be in the same facility. I'm excited to see what they're doing.
Especially if they fully embrace the brewing aspect and don't try to, the reason that this made sense to me is I tasted Stranahan's Colorado whiskey. I think I still have it, a little bit of batch number 23. And I was like, damn, here I am I used to hold a monthly whiskey tasting. I had bourbons and scotches on the table. And we tasted this whiskey and it just blew our mind. It was a new flavor. I'd never tasted anything like it. It didn't taste like bourbon, but it had bourbon aspects. It didn't taste like scotch, but it had scotch aspects. I was like, where does this come from? And so these are the days when I wasn't able to make it out to Colorado. So instead I went on Flickr. Flickr, I would type in Stranahan's, and everybody who had tagged their tours from Stranahan's had tagged Flickr. On Flickr had tagged it Stranahan's, and I got to see all these pictures. And I was like, damn, there's a whiteboard showing their recipe. They're not making wash, they're making beer. But they don't do that anymore. They now do a sour ferment, but they used to make a very clean beer because the brewery next door is making it. And that was my aha moment. I'm a brewer. I know how to do beer. And if Stranahan's is that good, then my goal was to beat Stranahan's in flavor. And, we just were lucky to come after them because they had proven that it can be differentiated. And that's where I kind of feel, we're just that one next step, but brewers are going to take over this space. And I think American single malt whiskey, this is total blasphemy coming from a Kentucky boy who right behind me are 600 bottles of bourbon. I'm going to tell you, American single malt whiskey is going to dominate American products. Whiskey. It's got so much more diversity opportunities. It's got so little creativity stifling rules around it. But bourbon does. Bourbon is like so tight, so hard to innovate in. Yes, you can do barrel finishes, but you really can't do a whole lot more. Man, with American single malt, you can just go crazy. So
The gulf of difference between this and this, not even just accounting for peated versus unpeated,
Right.
you know, is vast. And
Yep.
you know, bourbons you've got maybe 20% to be generous difference between, you know, Jim Beam and Elijah Craig.
Yeah.
By the way, for the listeners, Phil was just holding up Virginia Distillery Company's Courage and Conviction, as well as McCarthy's Oregon Single Malt, which were the unpeated and peated, respectively.
And I
Speaking
mean,
of peat,
wow.
Well, it sounds like a good segue.
um, last we talked, I had asked if we could taste the, Release 42 from
Yep.
Copperworks, which was the first to market American peated whiskey, as I understand it. Certainly the first from the Skagit Valley malting uh, malt. I've heard, I haven't done my research yet to check up on it. I've heard that the Pacific Northwest is no longer singular in using American peat to smoke barley, but that's neither here nor there. I believe this was the first ever to market American peat smoked barley whiskey. Um,
Yep. Just
and
mostly by COVID.
This is delicious, but it is the only one that you've done. I have heard that you have plans for additional peated whiskey in the future. But this seems complicated to me because Skagit Valley Malting has regrettably closed. What are your plans for peated whiskey going forward?
Well, remember, Skagit Valley Malting recently closed, but for the past 6 years, Westland and Copperworks have been buying peated malt from them and putting it into barrels, which is all maturing and coming out. So for that first release, you tasted 42, but we actually did a total of 5 different releases from that one batch. We released some at 3 years old, some at 4 years old. Frankly, I liked the 3 years old better because it had more peat. The 4 year old had subdued a little bit of that by the barrel influence. Um, we double peated one. We put one in an Ardbeg cask of all things. That was super fun, but it made our product taste like Ardbeg. And as delicious as 250 bottles of that was, we're not going to do that again. It's not. It doesn't tell the story about Washington or about anything. It just tells the story about what Ardbeg can do to a product you put into it, which was frankly really delicious. So back to your question, Skagit Valley Malting is closed. Westland and Copperworks are sitting on hundreds, if not thousands, because I don't know what their inventory is, of barrels of whiskey that has been made from 6 years of peated barley. So we're going to have lots of whiskey opportunities coming out. So are we going to worry right now about how we're going to protect that in the future? Only a little bit, because honestly, there's so much innovation in the equipment phase of malt, small drums, and the ability to make malt that I believe we will have that solved before it's even a problem for us. I don't know by whom. It could be somebody that doesn't exist yet. It could be somebody that's in another state, and we would ship peat and ship barley from Washington to them. I'm a big proponent of not doing the latter because I want to keep food miles down. And that is more important to me than chasing the tail of a particular flavor. So if peat never happens again in Washington, it was a time and a moment and a place, and we got to take advantage of it, and you'll get to drink it for 10 years to come. But after that, it's gone. And that's just what it is. I think the other concern that I have about peat is, what what peat is, if nothing else, is it is an incredible sequestering of carbon. And the one thing you don't want to do to that is dig it up and burn it, which is the thing that you do to make peated malt. So yes, you only use a small amount, and that's a good thing, but it's kind of like the opposite of good behavior. And so if I'm looking for a replacement of peat, even though I've eschewed this whole concept for years, I might start looking for smoked malt, not peated malt. And the reason I do that is because that breathes a whole nother life into cherry trees that were pulled out on the east side of the state, from cherry farms or apple trees. And if that's a revenue stream for farmers over there who are fruit farmers and they can get money for their fruit wood that goes into a flavor, and then they can have a whiskey that was eventually, matured and it has their flavor of their farm. I think that's great. And so I'm probably going to be heading that direction. If we even chase that at all, that would be the direction I would replace it with. But if peat comes back, and if we feel that it's being mined the way the peat in Shelton is responsibly, and used judiciously, then I think we'll probably continue with it because it is delicious. I've been tasting peat samples now, for this year's release. They'll be coming out sometime in the Q1 of 2024. And man, it is really good. It's really good. So that's my peat rant.
So that's another way of developing flavor in the malt before it even goes into barrel. How to phrase this question? Mostly because I want to make sure I have a point. A lot of your releases have involved a heavy proportion of new oak.
Mm-hmm.
American single malt does not require that,
Right.
at least according to the proposal. Is the use of new oak in your case in any way a hedge in case the proposal doesn't go the way we want it to go?
Oh no. Remember, the proposal happened 7 years, 6, I don't know, a long time after we had already made the decisions on barrels. No, here's the thing. Used casks that were on the market were not casks that we wanted to buy. And what I mean by that is they were bourbon casks. Bourbon is built to be a one and done barrel. It's built with wood that has been kiln dried, not seasoned. And that the tannins and the astringency that comes out of that wood is great for bourbon, but we did not feel like it was going to be great for Copperworks. It is not toasted, so there's very little reuse of deep flavors in that wood because it's only charred, and you just have this little thin red layer behind of toast behind the char. So it's usable for one time to flavor, and then the next time, not too much. But we wanted the strong barrel flavor. Remember, I'm from Kentucky. I do love bourbon. So it was one of those things I wanted to bring that flavor in. And we wanted to buy barrels that we could use twice. The first time, we would use them as a new oak flavor profile. The second time, we would use them as our own high quality used casks. So that's what's starting to come out now. We're at our sweet spot for releases of new oak is between 3.5 to 5 years, maybe 3.5 to 4.5 actually. Our sweet spot for used, so second time used by us, will be probably around 8 years. I don't know. We haven't got much that's that old. The oldest we have right now is 7 years, and it's delicious. And we're starting to taste that, and even included in some blends or in some single cask decisions. We're bringing them into our blending workshops and getting feedback from people what they think about them. And I'm actually kind of amazed at how different. It's almost like two different whiskey distilleries, one in new oak and one in used oak. Yet the barrels were our barrels, and so I'm really really excited about this. And then we
Yeah.
have the choice to release those as two bottlings or put them together and create
Mhm.
concepts of there that bring in flavors from both. We haven't even really started that yet, but that's going to be coming up next. So back to
Yep.
new oak. Why new oak? I love the flavors. Um, we wanted to control the parameters of the barrel, so we had to buy them at our specs first, invest in them for 2 uses, and that way we knew the second use would have all the contributions that we wanted.
Would you consider a third use?
I would have said up until about 2 weeks ago, no. And the reason 2 weeks ago is I've always been kind of not interested in scraped, retoasted, and recharred barrels. I just don't really think that I want that flavor profile. But then I tasted a whiskey that was 9 months old out of an STR barrel, and I was like, damn, that is amazing. It's 9 months old and it's that good. You might want to rethink STR. And we could get, we spent around $600 for a new barrel. We get to use it twice. So if we could use it a third time, even if it costs us $100 to have it scraped, toasted, and recharred, I think it might be worth experimenting with that flavor. Wait, we'll know in 7 more years. It's just a waiting game. So who knows?
Well, all right. That answers all my questions about barrels, I think. And we are running low on time now. Let's see if there's any other questions I didn't get to. Phil, if you've got any questions queued up.
Everything I had thoughts about have been hit fairly thoroughly. I do have my perpetual question. How do you feel about doing barrel share collaborations with other distilleries that produce different products, such as brandies or different sorts of whiskeys and rums?
Yeah, one of my favorite things, right? We've already done, like I said, we've done tequila cask finish, mezcal cask finish whiskeys, and gins. We've done a rum whiskey and a rum gin. But the ones I'm really excited about are like Sons of Vancouver up in BC. They make oh good grief, what is it? It's not it's not an Amaro. It's a God, I just can't get the word in my head now. It must be the whiskey I'm drinking. Anyway, we like experimenting with these flavors. Skip Tonetti at Letterpress Distilling puts his Amaro in our barrels, and then we take his barrel back after he's used it for his Amaro, and we put our whiskey in it, and that's one of my favorites. So we love doing those. The thing that's really fun about barrel exchanges is they're fast. They're a good story, and they're delicious, and you get to taste something. The thing that I'm much more interested in doing, and I think is we're hyper qualified to do, is working with brewers. Say, make your flagship product, make it without hops. We're going to ferment it, distill it, turn it into whiskey. And in 5 years, we'll have a whiskey from your flagship product. So not every brewery is going to be able to do that. They might not even be around by the time it's done. But that's where I feel real collaboration is like, this is that beer turned into whiskey. That's super exciting. And then if we
That
happen
is
to finish
extremely cool.
beer, so we're doing that now. They're just not available yet. So, yeah.
And I can say Phil already knows this, and I may have mentioned this to you when I saw you in Kenmore, Jason, that I went to a distillery called Seven Caves in San Diego that made a American single malt from an unfruited sour beer.
Wow.
So it was essentially ready to bottle beer that he then distilled. And then just for fun, he put it in a previously used peated American single malt cask of his own making. And the result is incredible.
Wow.
Starting from a fully fledged beer, and because it doesn't have hops in it and didn't have any fruit in it, it is completely compliant with American single malt whiskey as well.
That is so cool. See, that's what I mean. This category is just about to explode. When brewer aesthetics and brewers' creativity meet and just blow the doors off of traditional products, it's total greenfield out there. Whiskey has got so many opportunities to explore, and they haven't because they've been so tightly regulated and more regulated to the point where they can't innovate and still call it bourbon, still call it rye, still call it Tennessee, still call it Irish, Japanese, Scotch, whatever. They're to the point where they've lost their ability to innovate. But American single malt whiskey is just going to blow the doors off, and brewers are going to be the ones that take us there. I'm really excited to taste that. I hope we get a chance to. I don't know if you still have any of that, but
I do. I've got almost the entire bottle. I will bring you a sample next time I see you.
Love to taste that. That is so cool.
I
Right.
remembered I skipped right on past this paragraph on my sheet. I wanted to talk about the Queen's Run.
Oh, yeah.
That is
We,
such a cool concept. In broad strokes, it is take the heads and the tails from previous distillations and distill only that.
yep. So, when you make heads, hearts, and tails cuts, when you make that cut from heads to hearts and then from hearts to tails, you are um, you're deciding I'm getting too many off flavors to be able to continue to capture this as hearts. So I'm going to put it aside and then I'll redistill it and I'll still make that tight cut. But those products now have the maximum amount of those interesting edge flavors. You're still within your hearts cut parameter, but they are optimized for maximum flavor. So when distillers do this in Scotland, they would name it something like distiller's cut or specialty master blend or something of the sort. But rum, and I'm looking up here at my modern Caribbean rum book from Petrick, is famous for doing weird shit like that. And they've done this thing where they basically call it the Queen's Run, where they only use those tails and redistill. And I have to say that is exciting and fun stuff. And that's where some super interesting whiskey comes from. And it's a real privilege to be able to put some up in barrels. We have some casks that we'll have to talk about a whole nother podcast on. It's some of the collar cask from Spain, but that's another story. So yeah,
This whiskey is so much different from the rest of your portfolio that I've tried so far, even across independent bottlers and all those other products. This, as opposed to the bright, sweet, citrusy Copperworks that is almost every other Copperworks to some degree. There's, of course, variation release to release always. This is all chocolate cake and a little bit of like black cherry jam, and it's a different kind of bright, but just a little bit, and it's very dark as the body, and it has just a crazy like thick luscious mouthfeel. And this is also at cask strength as opposed to the usual 50%, and it doesn't drink hot at all.
no,
It's just an incredible drinking experience. I wanted to ask though, how do you, when you're distilling this, how do you strike the balance of collecting the flavors, the good flavors out of the faints,
so
and leaving behind the sort of nasty bits?
so there's two philosophies on how you will run a still. One philosophy is that you do everything organoleptically, that is, you smell and taste, and you through experience, right? So this has to be something based on enough experience to know what that will mature to, not just what it tastes like coming off the still, but what it will turn into. So that's something that most of us aren't privileged. We haven't been around that many years. Oh, it's time to do something. That is something that the even the old Scots distillers don't have that much experience in, because the other way is what's dominant. You make your cuts based on an ABV. You decide at this proof or this alcohol by volume, we're going to move from heads to hearts, and at this alcohol by volume, from hearts to tails. And that's the way we do it. And the reason we do it that way is so that we're consistent and consistently conservative. Because we know we're going to get those heads and tails back in the next batch, we don't care if we lose the alcohol in the first one. As a matter of fact, the first batch is the most uninteresting because it's just two batches of low wines, no faints are included. But the next batch and the batch after that and the batch after that all have maximum flavor coming in. And then the maximum is nothing but faints. That's the Queen's Run. But we still make our first cut at 147, our second cut at 121. Those are our proof cuts. 147 from heads to hearts, 121 from hearts to tails. That's a very conservative cut, by the way. They can be as high as 155 to cut into hearts and as low as 115 to cut to tails. And I find those be a whiskey made like that can be delicious, but it'll probably take 12 years and it'll be a completely different barrel program than we have. Ours would be empty in 12 years. So we'd have to be in a dunnage warehouse. Yeah, it's just not what we're interested in flavor wise.
All
So
right,
yeah,
we did get to 7 o'clock, and so even though I'm sure I could come up with more questions and fun philosophical conversations to have, it is time to wrap it up. Jason, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us about all these geeky topics for a full 2 hours. It's been a pleasure.
a lot of fun. Thank you. Enjoyed talking to both of you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Just stick on just a couple of minutes afterwards so that we can make sure that your recording is finished uploading. And I say we do a toast to get on out of here.
Let's do that. I drank all of mine the first time, so I'll have to pour a little more in. I'm drinking the 356 single cask. That's a 5 malt recipe.
I've got a little bit of the Queen's Run to get on out of here.
Nice. And what are you drinking, Philip?
I've got a glass of the McCarthy's Oloroso finish.
Ooh.
Ooh.
Nice.
Well, it's been a pleasure. We didn't get to talk about the Whiskey Lodge at all today, but my usual cheers is it's been great talking to you. Cheers. And until next time, we'll see you in the lodge.
See you in the lodge.
Cheers.
Cheers.